So I'm Tina Owens. I work with transformational investing in food systems, and we are a decentralized organization working on how to bring more investment into the regenerative space. I've been part of the regenerative movement since 2016 and part of the organic movement since 2008, and really started putting down different roots in the regenerative movement relative to what has to shift in order for the full system to convert to regenerative ag. I'm using 2 decades of my corporate background to understand systems level transformation. I don't know how else to describe my work in the regenerative movement. It crosses finance and policy and crop insurance and nutrient density. I'm a bit of a generalist, but working ahead of the system on transforming those gaps that have yet to be addressed at scale. I have been part of the network since 2016, and I don't think it was called Soil and Climate Alliance just yet. So I've been attending for 9 years now. And what keeps me coming back is that each year is a bit of a different mix of the breadths of the community, keeping a pulse on what's happening in the field, but also what's happening in human and health sciences relative to the movement. Um, a lot of my education and support has come from within this community. And so when I look back at what I've been able to accomplish over the course of my career within regenerative agriculture, a lot of the connections, expertise, and communal development has come from this space and working with my colleagues at SCA. So I'm very appreciative of this community and what it represents. So for me, it was also the partnership of being able to found the Nutrient Density Alliance in conjunction with the Soil and Climate Alliance and the Non-GMO Project. And that has deepened my ability to convene and collect groups of people in the space that all are interested in seeing similar change happen. Mary Purdy, of course, now leads the Nutrient Density Alliance, and I'm delighted to have helped bring her to this table because she's an even more equipped change maker than I am as it relates to that. Soil and Climate Alliance is what you make of it. And so if you're interested in connection, if you're interested in partnership, if you're interested in learning more, all of that is available to you. But if you sit back and relax and just take it in but don't do anything, it may not change anything for you personally, but if you dive in and treat it like a river of information that has a continuation, I have found that it creates a lot of meaningful connection that supports my work and my own decision-making process within the regenerative movement and having better visibility to what needs to happen next and how I can be part of it. Right now, that is the work that hasn't been done in the finance community in supporting regenerative transition, in the operating and loan capacity of the farm credit system for supporting farmer transition, and in massive systems change like crop insurance that are barriers for farmers to actually move into this space voluntarily. And I've gone the consumer demand route. I actually started 6 years of my work on nutrient density from within two of the world's largest food companies. And consumers can only purchase what they're offered. And if companies are unwilling to offer that change to them, they may give up looking for it inside the grocery store. And so I have come to believe that while consumer choice is an important component of relevance of the regenerative movement, real change is going to happen in how farmers access resources and their profitability and economic stability on the farm. What's missing is the risk and resilience data that the mainstream system uses as it relates to how insurance and underwriting and lending and public stock holding and institutional shareholder wealth is measured. And so it's actuarial data that's missing at the end of the day. Farmers who practice soil health actually have much better outcomes than conventional farms, to the point now that insurance companies are calling it the difference between a smoker and a non-smoker from an insurance and actuarial perspective, which is a startling way to think about it. And it's baseline soil health practices like cover crops, crop rotation, no and low till that create that risk and resilience. And so now we're at the point where there's that realization, and farmer pools that have started practicing regen and those who want to practice regen now need to be banded together in transition to create actuarial data that demonstrates the true risk reduction in those systems. But that doesn't only need to be used in crop insurance. It can be used in lending. For institutional shareholders and companies with regenerative agriculture commitments, it can also demonstrate how an investor would measure the risk and resilience of the supply chain that those companies are sourcing from, and what it means for their stock resilience and for any lag that's happening on dividends or profitability values, because currently that's hidden in the cost of goods. So it's already part of the profitability equation of food companies. And these data, the data of field risk and the data of company risk, have not yet synced up in a way that institutional shareholders can see and value. So it's a really big part of what has to happen next in market maturity. And it also impacts how lending interacts with the entire system and becomes an enabler rather than a barrier in helping farmers transition. So the example I use to help make it personable for people is one of two things. Back in 2006 is roughly in the United States when it became known what the cost was for health insurance for smokers. And you saw a $2,000 premium that smokers started having to pay on their insurance. And so my example is, if we all smoked for 5 years and quit, probably 10 years later, our metrics would have recovered and we'd be roughly the same from a health and cost perspective. But if we were to smoke for 50 to 70 years, not only our personal cost of what we could afford, but what the system then has to cover in public services around healthcare, the cost becomes untenable and it becomes something you can't recover from because it is so great when spread across so many different people taking that same risk. And it's now become the same with farmers and soil in that we have been tilling and adding chemical interventions for 50 to 70 years. And so we're finally at the point where that system is untenable in what it's able to support. And weather events are getting more disruptive. And so even a 6-inch rainfall event, if you've been doing continuous living cover for 3 to 4 years, you're likely to get through that and have your crops rebound and the water infiltrate. But if you've been doing conventional tillage and agriculture for decades, you will need a payout. There is no getting away from that risk. You then are the person that needs chronic intervention. All your topsoil also just washed away. And that's not something you recover from in one season, especially if you're not adopting regenerative practices. And so then the risk compounds going forward the same way it would for someone who moves from having smoking-related diseases to someone who has emphysema. And the data is now starting to bear out on how critical the divergence is in the risk of those systems. And we can no longer afford the cost of subsidizing the other parts of the system from a 50 to 70 year cycle of disrupting soil and chemical interventions. We've all seen some version of this in our life, and we understand how our own health insurance has changed, become more expensive, become harder to access, or what it looks like to have a chronically ill society that now Medicare and Medicaid interventions are becoming so costly that people are disrupting how access to them is given. And if it wasn't for the American taxpayer coming in and covering crop insurance, that same thing would have already happened in agriculture insurance, because the same symptoms are occurring there that are occurring in health. So this was something I've been speaking about since I uncovered it for myself personally. There's others who've also come to the same conclusion, that the life cycle assessment methodology that companies use to measure their emissions footprint actually excludes data on organic, perennial, regenerative, and indigenous managed lands, which are more than 50% of land masses globally and also the parts we need to survive as a species. And if companies are investing in regenerative agriculture or have perennial crops or work with indigenous communities or sourcing organically, currently those systems are pegged as being inefficient. And it's not because they are, it's because the tool was created by the chemical industry in the late 1960s and the early 1970s to measure pollutants. So field passes, chemicals used at the plant, like natural gas, et cetera, recycling systems, refrigerants, and pesticide use, and all of the fossil fuel inputs. So it's been about reducing pollutants. Instead, we've started to use it as a substitute for a conversation about reducing emissions. But emissions reduction actually occurs in agriculture when you're building soil organic matter, sourcing food more locally, and reintegrating animals back in the system, or using plants that exist for 10, 50, 100 years like perennials do, many of which are managed by indigenous communities around the world: coffee, cocoa, palm oil, etc. The value of those systems and what they provide in ecosystem services are currently excluded from how companies measure their emissions. And so when you take some companies that have over 90% of their emissions in scope 3 and they have a regenerative ag program, they'll use an LCA to do a baseline, and they'll do their regen ag program and do another LCA, and they won't see a reduction, not because the reduction didn't occur, but because the system doesn't know how to measure it. And it actually is using some legacy information on yield gap, a yield dip in transition that only occurs in the first couple of years in transition, either in organic or in regenerative, and then rebounds later and tends to be higher and is more resilient after that point. And so there's a weaning effect. Somehow the system got convinced that in those first couple of years when you have a yield gap, that's in perpetuity. And so it obscures the value of these systems by making it seem like you would need so much more land to support the same amount of agriculture you have today, without taking into account the fact that animal stocking rates can be higher on regenerative pasture, that organic products keep multiple pollutants out of our rivers, our streams, our food systems, et cetera, that lead to more efficiencies elsewhere in things like healthcare or chronic disease. And so new systems like true cost accounting actually are starting to measure the full cost, the internal and external cost of food systems in ways that information will become visible. But for now, back to institutional shareholder interests, it will look like mismanagement for regenerative or organic companies currently if you only measure them in today's terms. And this is now a problem that's being laddered up in some of the largest discussions around institutional shareholder interests. And so what that leads to is a lack of valuing for organic brands or regenerative brands. And so that impacts how the capital system enters the space. Does a large organic company divest its organic brands because they're less efficient by corporate math? Do they stop buying regenerative or organic brands that have led to buyouts that VC likes to see because they're less efficient and the corporate math is going in the wrong direction? And so it's a big chess piece on the board that leads to how the capital investment system interacts with everything that is organic, regenerative, perennial, or indigenous. It's a big problem, and I probably just shared it in a rather complicated way, but it is complicated, and it's something that a lot of people aren't even aware is part of the decision-making system, and it's how every chief sustainability officer and every chief financial officer and the C-suite of every company is starting to talk about their portfolio, is through the lens of that data. And that data excludes the systems we're talking about as being the solutions. Furthermore, if that data excludes it, then the AIs that are trained on that data are trained on yesterday's legacy answers that exclude the systems we actually need for solutions going forward. And so then we recreate the problem in perpetuity because we only are using the data that was created back in the 60s and the 70s when different questions and different needs were being asked and answered. And it was more about litigation risk and Chicago Board of Trade and pricing stabilization, and not the core problems we have today in system and ecosystem collapse. The economics of those solutions and systems have to be made clear to the people who hold all the cards on what gets invested in. And so that's why I keep using the term institutional shareholders, because if I own stock in 15 different companies at a significant level, there's nowhere I can go on the planet to divest myself out of that risk. Furthermore, all of civil and economic society rests on food and ag. So if food and ag are destabilized, the rest of your portfolio is destabilized. And so the more that we state these things with obvious details attached to them, with support from insurance companies, central banks, true cost accounting measures, et cetera, the more credible it makes it in their decision making and understanding how fundamental this is to the cost structures they're accepting today that are becoming unwieldy, to the risk on their balance sheets that they're looking for ways to mitigate, and to how you create a stable, more stable path for the future by working on regeneration. And the conversations are heading in the right direction. Have faith.